So thank you for reconvening and joining us for this fourth panel of the conference on contested heritage. We have today with us in the room Dr. Peter Wien, and he's going to present. And then we have two presenters online that are joining us from the UK and from also, I believe, Ohio. But first, I think we shall turn to our in-person presenter. So, Dr. You know, the great thing about this conference is how it's generated so much conversation that I have become, for example, distracted from my duties. So I have to rush around and find what it is that I'm supposed to be presenting. So Dr. Wien joins us from the University of Maryland, where he has been teaching, wrong package. Let me find you, Dr. Wien. Yes, he's a professor of history and of the modern Middle East at the University of Maryland, College Park. And he has been there since 2006. He holds a PhD or a DPhil in Islamic Studies, Modern History, and Semitic Studies from a very long-named university in Bonn. So I will just say Universität Bonn. And has studied at Oxford University and also another university in Heidelberg. Dr. Wien's research, am I pronouncing your name correctly? Dr. Wien's research focuses on Arab nationalism, modern Middle East history, and the intersection of politics and culture. He's held numerous prestigious fellowships, including the Klug Research Fellowship at the Library of Congress and the Karl Ferdinand Werner Fellowship at the German Historical Institute in Paris. Dr. Wien is also president of the Academic Research Institute in Iraq. And in fact, his talk today is about problematic archives in Iraq. So I'll give the floor to Dr. Wien. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you to all of you for being here. And thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to present in this conference, which has been extremely inspiring and interesting over the past few days. And there are actually many echoes of the things that we've discussed over this past day, actually, in my paper here. So I see myself and so many of the topics again here. So the paper is about Iraqi archive politics. It's also a comment on archives as heritage in post-conflict situations, and largely it is a synopsis of an article that I recently published last year. But I'm adding an outlook on parallels to the Syrian situation or situation in Syria today. So my starting point is that Iraqi archive politics are shaped by a paradox. Which is, on the one hand, that there's a scarcity of knowledge and documentation that exists for most of modern Iraqi history, but that is juxtaposed against an abundance of archival materials of a specific but very problematic kind, and about a very specific period and aspect of modern Iraqi history. So, scarcity versus abundance. What I'm talking about here is the archival records that were expatriated from Iraq to the United States, starting in the early 1990s, who were then digitized and made at least partially available for researchers in the United States, and thus out of reach for virtually all historians of Iraqi nationality, in Iraq in particular, which creates limitations of accessibility, especially for those, and primarily for those, whose stories of suffering, coping, and survival actually inhabit these archives. To start with, a frame, the cultural historian Omnia Shakri published an article in 2015 in which she calls Middle Eastern history, in the title of this article, a history without documents. I think that's it's a great article, but the title is sort of a misnomer, because we should rather talk about or speak of a history without archives, because historians of the modern Middle East certainly use documents, but many of these documents, even the archival documents, are from Western archives, which is just a consequence of the fact that most modern states in the region until today do not give easy access or not even access at all to state documents and archives. For Iraq, the retrieval and expatriation, and then also finally repatriation of Ba'ath Party archives that started in the early 1990s, and that it revolutionized and revolutionized the writing of Iraq's recent history based on Iraqi archives, but mostly by Western historians, is what makes the situation for Iraq unique in that broader context. And especially what I'm referring to here is the seemingly unlimited trove of governmental documents at the Hoover Institution in Stanford, California. A number of groundbreaking publications have appeared over the past 2 decades that show the potentials of these collections. Dissertations have been written that are not yet published, and there are also other dissertations that are in the works. But there are also increasingly and important voices among historian colleagues in the United States who argue against using these materials for research about Iraq, at least as long as they are not available for researchers in Iraq, because there is no real scholarly community that bridges the continental divide and that would help Iraqis to benefit from their own documentation. Again, Omnia Shakri also points to a second conundrum that affects archives in general, not just the Middle Eastern archives. So she says that all archives are constructed by the various practices of collection and the privileging of certain voices over others that happens in archiving as a practice, as a professional practice. And the colonial archives are obviously a particularly clear example in that context. But likewise, the Iraqi documents that I'm talking about, they were produced in a specific context and for specific purposes, and therefore remain but a flashlight on Iraqi society. So if we read them merely along the grain, we will, in a way, reproduce a particular vision of state and society in Iraq in the 20th century, replicating a state-centered and arguably a sectarian paradigm based on the specific anxieties and obsessions of the security administration of the Ba'athist state under Saddam Hussein. Let me now turn to some details about what I call the 2003 moment in Iraq historical research. A new chapter of Iraq historical research began on April the 9th in 2003 with the completion of the US conquest of Baghdad. The following day, a massive looting of Baghdad's public institutions began, largely without interference by the occupying forces, without interference to prevent it. A mob attack on the National Iraq Museum of Antiquities attracted most of the public attention, also in the West, but at the same time, many other universities, libraries, and archives in Iraq that lay outside of the Kurdish region in the north were exposed to a purposeful looting as well. According to a contemporary report by Saad Iskander, who was at the time after the invasion became the director of the National Library and Archives in Baghdad, and who was one of the most important advocates for Iraqi archival and library heritage. So according to Iskander, more or less 60% of the Ottoman, monarchical, and Ba'ath era documents were lost to fire and water damage in the aftermath of the invasion. So this was a cataclysm in itself, the major destruction. But at the same time, another set of actors were at work in Baghdad, and these were both military and civilian, and mostly American or Iraqi American actors who conducted an archival conquest, the like of which the world had not seen since World War II. It was these actors who actually expatriated the records of the Ba'ath Party Regional Command from Baghdad, and also on a much larger scale, US military actors who took possession of Iraqi state records, which then amounted to about 100 to 120 million pages of documents were taken to the United States. However, even though I called it the 2003 moment in Iraq historical research because it actually triggered, that expatriation triggered this new kind of historiography, the expatriation of Iraqi archives did not begin in 2003 only. American agencies had already captured Iraqi document sets in several waves, starting with the administrative files of the Iraqi occupation forces captured in 1991 during Operation Desert Storm after the liberation of Kuwait City, and then also, and importantly for me, the North Iraq data set, which was more or less 5 million pages of documents, and both of them arrived, and this NIDS, North Iraq data set, arrived in the US in the context of the 1991 Kurdish uprising against the Ba'athist state and the establishment of the safe zone and Kurdish autonomy in northern Iraq. So the story of this North Iraq data set is basically the origin story of this process of expatriation of Iraqi archives to the United States. So these NIDS files were secured by Kurdish Peshmerga fighters when initially they managed to drive out Iraqi forces from Kurdish cities and villages in the context of the uprising that followed Iraq's defeat in Operation Desert Storm in 1991. These Kurdish fighters negotiated the handover of these documents with a number of US government agents and members of the Human Rights Watch and Middle East Watch NGO, and who then together removed the documents overseas for safekeeping under the condition that they would be returned later on. Instrumental in this process was a man named Kanaan Makia, who is an Iraqi-American architect and also a dissident and well-known opposition member of the Iraqi exile opposition, already in the 1990s, 1980s, 1990s. Once in the United States, the documents were first stored at the National Archives in College Park, very close to here, and then Human Rights Watch collaborated with researchers that the US Defense Intelligence Agency provided in cataloging and digitizing the documents. Then, they were for a certain period of time at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and then finally the digital copies went to Kanaan Makia's Iraq Research and Documentation Project at Harvard. And this project later on was turned over, the project turned into Kanaan Makia's Iraq Memory Foundation, which then found a final place in the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. After Saddam Hussein's capture in 2003, the original documents were sent back to the Iraqi judiciary for his trial, and then were deposited in the Iraqi National Archives, and there, where they are today, they remain inaccessible. So far, the Kurds in northern Iraq have only received a digital copy of these files. So the story of the North Iraq data set is basically the playbook for the events that followed the 2003 Iraq invasion, US-led Iraq invasion. Right after the invasion, Kanaan Makia, who we've heard about before, discovered a huge trove of Ba'ath Party regional command documents in the basement of a presidential palace in Baghdad. And he took these documents, so this trove of documents, and first stored them in his own home, in his house in Baghdad, and then later transported them to the United States with US government help. They were at first placed under the guardianship of his Iraq Memory Foundation, and then later on, after they were digitized, they were passed on to the Hoover Institution, or I think actually the Hoover Institution conducted the digitization. Makia claimed that the removal of the documents from Iraq happened with the agreement of Iraqi government authorities, which is fiercely contested by people like the aforementioned Saad Iskander, and was also heavily criticized at the time by the Society of American Archivists and the Association of Canadian Archivists. The much larger set of Iraqi documents seized directly by the US Army in the wake of the invasion was digitized also in the United States and uploaded in the United States to a classified database named Harmony. Only a small part of the documents was made available to researchers in the Conflict Records Research Center at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. And the center was defunded then in 2015. And access to the documents has been closed since, even though I've heard that they've been recently handed over, the digital files have recently been handed over to the Hoover Institution too, where they're about to become available. The presence and processing of these documents in the United States raises many questions of cultural ownership, of course. For some, the cataloging and digitization of the various files followed a logic determined by plans of international prosecution of war crimes, which never materialized. For Kanan Makia, he was driven by the idealistic plan to create a museum of Ba'athist abuse and to plant the memory of Ba'athist abuse in future Iraqi collective memory. That also never materialized, so the creation of this museum. Ultimately, one of the most important drivers of the decision to take and digitize and keep the record of this document came from the US government, which was planning to use them as evidence, to use the evidence of atrocities in these files as a propaganda weapon against Baathism. Also at a time when the argument that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction were could no longer be upheld. So they were trying to revert back to this argument of atrocities. So it should be clear now that these archives are indeed problematic archives. And recent users of the archives have been increasingly self-reflective about them. Some say that some point primarily to the political and economic barriers that bar Iraqi researchers from obtaining visa to travel to the United States, or that bar them from residing in expensive areas such as Palo Alto for extended periods of research time. So historians residing in the United States and working at US academic institutions have to weigh questions of ethics and equity of access before they make decisions about their research strategies. On the other hand, US institutions hosting the Iraqi materials point to legal agreements that had been made with various Iraqi actors prior to the removal of the documents in the aftermath of 2003, even though they are contested. But I think we also have to admit that, in fact, the removal of the documents may have actually truly saved them from destruction, at least in some, if not in many cases. As of today, nearly all the original materials have been returned to Iraq, to very little fanfare, actually. They sit in airport hangars awaiting processing and the establishment of a clear legal framework for archival access in Iraq that would balance freedom of information against the protection of sensitive data in the volatile security situation in Iraq. So the problem remains very complex. But all of these questions and their respective answers by various actors, by different actors, leave a deep imprint on the collections and what these collections mean for different constituencies. The British archival scholar Rebecca Whiting argues that the moving and handing over of archival collection actually transforms the nature of the collection. Changing proprietors of the North Iraq dataset each redefined the contents with regard to their potential usage, which also had an impact on the framing and even the cataloging of the collection. For the Kurds, initially, the interest to take possession of these documents was arguably that they wanted to weed out moles in their midst. The US government initially wanted to find evidence for WMD programs. Human Rights Watch, that was also involved, wanted to use the documents to prepare for taking the Iraqi government to court for genocide in Kurdistan. And all of these agendas left their imprint through specific cataloging and keyword indexing done by the various agents who were involved. in these processes, and resulting in meaningful changes to the physical state, to the order of the documents, and to the way accessibility is directed, and arguably research outcomes are co-determined. It's not surprising, therefore, that most works that are based on the collections highlight Ba'athist politics of control and the abuse tactics of the regime, as well as its attempts to do away with the diversity of the Iraqi population, especially in the north, in Kurdistan, and to do away with political pluralism. These are all very important works, but they reproduce the state-centered power relationships that were promoted by those who created the archives in the first place. Another scholar, another historian of Iraq, Arbela Bechlimon, establishes a trajectory between the removal of antiquities by Western archaeologists in the early decades of the 20th century from sites in late Ottoman and early statehood Iraq to the early 20th century. So a trajectory from these antiquity problems to the early 21st century expatriation of archives. So back then, Western diplomats, politicians, and specialists claimed that they were saving the materials from potential destruction and were acting in the interest of preserving heritage for mankind. In other words, Iraqis and their heritage had to be protected against themselves, with the effect that Western museums and archival collections were enriched for the enjoyment and use primarily by people from the West. And we see a similar situation with these archives today. It's again Rebecca Whiting who claims that these archival collections are more than just a collection of bits and pieces of information. Collectively, they become meaningful objects with changing meanings attached to them, or in Whiting's words, they become artifacts. So the entire archive becomes an artifact. Archives like the NIDS change the meaning attached to them depending on who controlled them at a particular time, between the Iraqi Ba'athist Intelligence Service, the Kurdish Peshmerga, the Iraq Memory Foundation, or the scholars at the Hoover institutions, and finally the Iraqi state authorities who've received them, who've now taken custody of them. Everybody attaches different meanings to without even regarding the details that are in them. Restitution debates of expatriated archival collections are therefore about obtaining information as much as they are about the meta-meanings of the collections, their appreciation, and about the state's and the people's sovereign abilities, as well as the autonomy over defining one's own identity and historical authenticity. Compare the archival expatriation debate to the financial efforts and international legal structures that have been put in place for heritage protection in the field of archaeology and antiquities. The tension between national patrimony on the one hand and the notion of world heritage, UNESCO World Heritage on the other hand, including also the stewardship of major national institutions such as the Louvre, the British Museum, or various US academic institutions, they have received new attention in recent post-colonial restitution debates. The parallels to the archival repatriation processes are remarkable, including how digitization methods have become the holy grail of compromise solutions, as well as debates about retaining originals in the European collections as loans, or the panic about an alleged lack of expertise or a lack of regard among the public in non-European countries for this heritage. Also, trafficking of historical documents is happening like the trafficking of antiquities, but it receives a great deal less attention than the trafficking of antiquities. National historic memory has less potential to attract international support than world heritage, after all. Western researchers and research organizations should rethink the role they can play in addressing issues of patrimony, access, and broadly speaking, their role in empowering Iraqis to claim their own voice. You have recent examples for the ways how people actually do claim their own voice and develop agency in the context of the Syrian war, Syrian revolution, and its citizen archivism. So collections have been preserved and are largely available online, where NGOs or associations of Syrian opposition activists outside of Syria preserve a variety of media documenting information on a range of topics, from regime atrocities to actually the creative reactions by civil actors on the ground to the onslaught by the Syrian regime. This leads me to the final part of my talk, where I would like to weigh the ideas that I've just presented, or contextualize them in the context of of what's been happening recently in Syria, with very little information that I have about the Syrian situation right now. So we have all seen the images of desperate Syrians combing through prison registries in Sumaiya and other places of unspeakable horror in the surroundings of Damascus and the rest of the country. With documents strewn over the floor, I could not help thinking about the irrevocable damage done to the collective memory of Syria. Only one aspect of which is the potential for restorative justice and reconciliation, for which at some point the documents might be needed. So the ransacking of the material from these prisons, these prison archives might actually be in the interest of the perpetrators, after all. The destruction of these documents, and there are many examples that we find throughout history where this archival destruction was rather, even though it happened in the aftermath of regime change, it was actually in the interest of the perpetrators from the previous regime. So there are, like 2 weeks after the fall of the Assad regime, articles already appeared, by Amnesty International and Foreign Policy, that were actually pointing to the danger of the destruction of these documents, and how they might be of interest, in fact, might have to be used in the documentation of crimes in future prosecution. But the question is, what else is going on in Syria, not only with regard to these issues of prosecution and transitional justice, but also with regard to archives as artifacts that should constitute national heritage and on the long run should contribute to the emergence of a critical collective memory in Syria if you want to create a sustainable state in Syria. I have a snapshot only on the archive situation in Iraq. There's very little known, actually, even inside Iraq, inside in Syria, it turns out. So recently I had a conversation with the Syrian historian Sami Mubayyid, who actually paints a very desolate picture of the situation in Damascus in particular. But it has not only been desperate since the removal of the Assad regime, but the situation was quite dire before that, actually. So, for 2 days after Assad's fall and his departure, which happened on December 8, 2024, there was looting going on, in particular in the presidential palaces in Damascus, including the ransacking and stealing of documents. Some of you may have seen the images that were circulating at the time. It's reminiscent to a certain extent of what happened in Baghdad in 2003, though it happened at a much smaller scale, I believe. According to Sami Mubayyid, some important documentation actually survived because it was kept in a safe. And now the palaces and also other government installations are quite reliably protected by the security forces, like former Hayat Tahrir al-Sham forces that have now become security forces of the state. But the documentation that was in these palaces really only started in 1970, so it's not like a comprehensive state archive that you would find in these palaces anyway. There are other collections that existed in Iraq. One that Sami pointed to were, for example, the parliamentary records, so the records of the Syrian parliament, but they, he told me, had already been removed from the parliamentary complex and moved to a storehouse in 2005, but that storehouse actually was torched during the years of war and revolution in Syria. He also told me about the foreign ministry in Syria, but he said they actually never kept records because they had a policy of shredding out of secrecy concerns or so. I don't know. He said, when I asked him about the Ba'ath Party archives in Syria or the archives of the Mukhabarat, the secret services in Syria, he said, nobody knows. So there's no information where they are and what state they actually are. The same is true for the Ministry of Information, where Sami actually told me that he knew the person who became the new minister and he visited him in the ministry, and then they went on a quest for documents, actually found archives, but this new minister said, well, I had never even bothered to wonder about where these documents are, so these are not really a concern in the current situation. There has been an institution in Damascus specifically for historical research. I used it myself way back in 2007, which is the Dar al-Wathaiq al-Tarikhiyya, so the historical archive of Syria, which keeps government papers until 1958, so Syrian government papers until 1958, which is before the Ba'athist period, and it also and primarily actually houses Ottoman documents that were collected in this archive. It used to be housed in an old palace in Old Town Damascus, and prior to the current, current ongoing, hopefully it's over, war and revolution, there was actually a project maintained by the Japanese to preserve in particular the Ottoman documents. But the problem is that this house, this old house actually burned down in 2023, apparently unrelated to the war, and it's not clear what happened with these documents afterwards. Some of them may have been saved, but nobody knows whether they were actually transferred to a different place, even though there was a plan to transfer them to the National Library. Sami also conducted prior to that burning a digitization project with an NGO that he runs, but he now has thousands of documents on a hard drive and no way to actually process them. So this is the situation. So, and I'm coming to an end. The most pressing issue that he presented to me when I asked him about it said that actually there's no information about what exists in Syria. Nobody knows what Syrians have in terms of this archival heritage. So there needs to be a database. It's not really about preservation so much. It's more about knowledge, actually. Knowledge about documentation of what we have. And I think similar situation is actually still a burning issue in Iraq, that we don't really know what documentation exists in this state. So in Syria in particular, there's no institutional anchoring for archival collections. Nobody has oversight, and nobody actually knows which institution should take that oversight. Should it be the prime minister? Should it be another ministry? Who would fund it? How would the funds be allocated? So these are all issues that are totally unresolved. One might even say that the situation in Syria is more dire than it has been in Iraq, because for better or for worse, the presence of a hegemonic power, with the Americans, to a certain extent helped in the stabilization of at least some of the materials, if as illegal as the removal may have been. It certainly stabilized the material to a certain extent. So let's hope that a similar stabilization in a legal way is possible in Syria. I mean, Sami and I agreed that any transitional justice and reconciliation needs those documents, but in Syria. But I would also argue that these post-conflict, or maybe still in conflict, or transitional societies, they need also a means to find positive identification with the past, or let's say critical identification with the past, to negotiate something like a sustainable national identity core, so to create a common narrative for the state, as critical and as diverse as it may be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wien. And now we will shift our attention geographically, temporally a little bit, but also in terms of discussing what might be lost to physical structures. So our next presentation is being provided by Farhat Afzal, who is currently a PhD student in architecture at the University of Cincinnati. She has a master's degree also in architecture already from Bangladesh's University of Engineering and Technology, and a bachelor's in architecture again from the American International University in Bangladesh. Her research explores colonialism, architectural history, and urban transformations in Bengal, as well as public perceptions of space and identity in South Asia. She has held teaching and research positions at the University of Cincinnati and Bengal Institute for Architecture, Landscapes, and Settlements. She has published widely in academic and public forums, including the Daily Star, VAS Journal, and in edited volumes like The Next 50, Collective Futures. She presented recent work at the ACSA, which I gather is an American Association of Architecture of some kind, right? At their annual meeting in New Orleans and the International Planning History Society Conference in Hong Kong. From 2016 to 2023, she served as assistant editor and contributor for VAS, curating discourse on architecture, art, and society. She'll be talking to us today about the destruction of a very notable monument, the notorious destruction of a very notable monument in South Asia, the Babri Masjid, between history, historicism, and myth. Please welcome Farhat Afzal.
Thank you, Dr. Hamdani, for that wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to be on such a wonderful panel with such esteemed speakers. I'm going to pull up my slides and share my screen. Oops. Oh. So I'm trying to pull up my notes as well, but it looks like it shows up for the audience as well on the screen. Okay, so when we look at history and how it's usually written, we still consider Europe to be the default lens through which everything else is viewed. So even when we talk about Indian or Chinese or Mexican histories, they often seem to be framed as side stories or variations of this giant universal European narrative. So this is a bit strange, but this happens all the time. And histories from all over the world sort of gets pushed to the margins and treated as if they're mere adaptations of some of the grand European narrative. And that being said, it is clear that historians, no matter where they're from, they also bring in their own beliefs, politics, and social context into how they write history, and whether it's about buildings or broader cultural events. And so the historian E.H. Carr actually points this out as well. He says that what we think of as history is shaped by choices the people have made and people who have had particular viewpoints and only kept the facts that fit with those perspectives. So why do we even bother with learning history or historicism in today's day and age, especially at a time where architecture is increasingly all about futuristic designs like cutting-edge tech or AI or sleek new materials? So it's a fair question, but even in today's globalized world where cultures are constantly mixing and influencing each other, we're still seeing conflicts erupting over historical sites and monuments. And these places have a lot of complicated and painful pasts that haven't just faded away. And so for the US, take the US, for example, in recent years, there's been a lot of debate and protest around the Confederate movements. And these are not just old statues. They have a lot of flashpoints for deeper issues about identity, memory, and power. And so this is why understanding history and how we interpret it has become more important instead of less. And so this helps us make sense of why this tensions exist in the first place, and they also equip us with tools to engage with them in a more thorough way. So one powerful of such a site of a contested history is the city of Ayodhya in Uttar Pradesh, India. So this is where the Babri Masjid stood until the year 1992, when it was demolished by Hindu nationalists. So many Hindus believe that the site of Ayodhya is actually the birthplace of the deity Rama, which has made it a very symbolic and sensitive location. And unfortunately, this is the reason why Ayodhya has been at the center of ongoing ongoing tensions between Hindu and Muslim communities for over 30 years now. So in this presentation, I want to explore why this understanding of history and the idea of historicism really matters in today's day and age, especially in cases like Ayodhya. So I will look at the site through the perspectives of both Western thinkers like Hegel, as well as Eastern scholars like Dipesh Chakraborty. So my purpose is to show how these different ways of thinking about history can help us understand these complex conflicts in a more nuanced way, and maybe even open up space about new interpretation and dialogue for these sites. So before we dig deeper into this topic, it's worth taking a moment to clear up the difference between the notion of history and historicism. So one of the key voices in this conversation, E.H. Carr, describes history as a collection of verified facts, but he also points out that it's not just about listing those facts. Historians make choices about what to include based on what they think is really important. And in other words, history is not just about what happened, but also who decides about what's important. So Carr talks about how modern historians have a more challenging job than those who were living in the 19th century. Back then, the focus was more on collecting as much objective, indisputable information as possible, but Carr criticizes this old school approach. He calls this a 19th century fetishism of facts, basically an obsession with piling up facts without stopping to interpret them. So for Carr, these facts only start to matter when someone gives them meaning, when a historian puts them into a meaningful context. So this is where human perspective becomes really important, because humans write history. Our understanding of what it means to be human shapes the way history gets told. Giambattista Vico, an 18th century philosopher, had a big idea about this in his book called New Science. He believed that human nature is pretty consistent across different times and places, and this means if we understand how people act today, we can make sense of how they acted in the past as well. So Vico argues that basic human instincts like the need for order, trade, and governance have always led societies down similar paths of development. And so in a way, history is not just about random events strung together. It follows patterns that actually reflect our shared humanity. And so unlike history, which is more about the facts and events themselves, historicism is about understanding those events within their specific context, how people at that time experienced and made sense of the world that was around them. It's about zooming in on the details of a particular moment in time and seeing how culture, society, and beliefs have shaped what has happened in the past. And so take the ongoing tension that's going on between Hindus and Muslims over the site in Ayodhya. To really understand what's happening there, it's not just enough to know the key dates or the events. We also need to understand India's complex social-religious history and why those specific places carry such deep meaning for such different communities. And one of the early thinkers behind this idea of historicism was J.G. Herder, and he believed that every culture is unique and develops according to its own internal logic. Because of that, he argued that we should not compare cultures directly or judge one by the standards of the other. And this idea helped lay the groundwork for what became known as historicism. And it was later expanded by philosophers like Hegel. Now, Hegel tried to bring non-Western civilizations like India and China into his version of world history. But here's the catch. He still saw these regions as static and unchanging, because in his eyes meant that they didn't really drive history forward in a meaningful way. So even though he included them in the canon, it was through a very narrow Eurocentric lens. And so, as we shall see, the distinction between history and historicism is relevant to understand what is considered a fact, what is the underlying context, and what is the historian's interpretation in the case of a site in Ayodhya. So the conflict in Ayodhya actually centers around a claim made by Hindu nationalists. They believe that the site where the Babri Masjid once stood is the birthplace of the Hindu deity Rama, and the mosque was built by tearing down or altering a pre-existing Hindu temple. But if we look at the mosque design itself, it actually fits right in with the architectural styles of the early Indian dynasties like the Tughlaqs, the Lodhis, and the Sharkis. The Babri Masjid was built in 1528 by Mir Baqi, who was a general under the Mughal Emperor Babur. Interestingly, the inscription on the mosque only credits Mir Baqi as the builder. It does not say anything about a demolished temple on the site. Even Babur's own memoirs did not mention any destruction of a temple in Ayodhya. So while the current dispute is fueled by religious and political claims, the historical and architectural evidence shares a more complicated story, one that is not clear-cut as some narratives would suggest. And so it's important to point out that the claim about Ayodhya being the birthplace of the Hindu deity Rama is not based on historical evidence. It actually comes from mythology. The story of Rama's life comes from the epic poem Ramayana, which was written by the legendary poet Valmiki. But like many ancient epics, Ramayana blends storytelling, symbolism, and cultural values, so it's really challenging to say how much of it is rooted in real historical events. And characters like Rama and the places mentioned in the poem could very well be fictional, or at least not historically verifiable, unless strong evidence is presented by historians. Interestingly, the idea that Ayodhya is Rama's birthplace did not gain serious traction until the mid-1800s. That was during the British colonial rule, when the administration was actively encouraging divisions between Hindus and Muslims as part of their divide and conquer strategy. And so the current conflict involves two very different foundations, one rooted in documented and historical records, and the other in religious belief and mythology. And so despite it being a mythology, it's still very meaningful to a particular community. And things get even murkier when you look into the actual geography of it all. According to Valmiki's own description of Ramayana, the city of Ayodhya should be located about 13 or 14 miles south of the Saryu River in what is now Nepal, not India. So this raises a question: why was the Ram temple even there in the first place? So archaeological investigations have not provided a clear answer either. Let me just on to the left slide. Yeah. So in 1975, the archaeologist B.B. Lal, who led the Archaeological Survey of India at that time, began to study the site. And at first, they did not find any evidence of a temple beneath the Babri Masjid. But then in the 1990s and the early 2000s, the team suddenly claimed to have found remnants of a temple structure underneath the mosque. And so, on the other hand, to counter this argument, the Sunni Central Waqf Board, which holds the legal claim to the mosque site, dismissed such findings, calling the report vague and contradictory. So even the archaeology has not really settled the debate. It's just added more layers to an already tangled story. Then again, how solid were the claims made by the Archaeological Society of India in the first place? In a 2022 article published in The Wire, Ashish Avikuntak, who teaches at the University of Rhode Island, wrote that during my ethnographic work at the ASI site, at the site of Baror in Rajasthan, an archaeologist had said, all senior archaeologists in the ASI have right-wing sympathies, meaning that archaeologists were more influenced by political ideologies instead of archaeological evidence or discoveries. And so in a situation that is as complicated and emotionally charged as Ayodhya, there are so many perspectives are at play. Here, historians often turn to something called hermeneutics, basically, which is the art of interpretation. And so it's not just about reading text, but also about making sense of the situations, actions, and the events in a more deeper way. And historians who use this approach try to uncover how meaning is created through human experiences, symbols, and behavior. So one way to apply this is by looking at Dipesh Chakrabarty's work in his influential book called Provincializing Europe, where he challenges the long-held notion that Europe is the origin of all things modern, like democracy, human rights, or even critiques of colonialism. He shows how these European frameworks have deeply shaped South Asian societies, but also how they've pushed aside rich intellectual traditions from places like India and the broader Islamic world, including texts in Sanskrit, Persian, and Arabic. And so one of his key points is about imbalance. Scholars in the Global South are expected to engage with European thought, but the reverse rarely happens. For over 200 years, European thinkers built sweeping theories about humanity, often without considering the lives or histories of most people outside of Europe. So when Chakrabarty talks about provincializing Europe, he's not saying we should throw European ideas out. He's saying we need to stop treating them as the default for universal truth. Especially in a world that's increasingly shaped by colonization, world wars, and deep inequalities. We have to rethink about how to write history and who gets to define what that history means. And philosophers like Hegel and Herder often saw non-Europeans as somehow not yet modern, as if they were waiting their turn to enter history. Chakrabarty calls on us to reject this kind of thinking. If the Global South is going to define its own path towards political modernity, it needs to do so on its own terms, not through the framework that was imposed on by others. And this kind of rethinking can really help us understand places like Ayodhya, where past and present, myth and history, power and identity are all deeply entangled. And so from such a post-Enlightenment perspective, it might seem like the Babri Masjid dispute should be settled using historical and archaeological evidence alone. After all, Enlightenment thinkers moved away from religious or mythical explanations and instead introduced the idea of progress, this belief that human civilization is steadily advancing towards something more rational and refined. History in that framework became a tool to track this progress. So this is where historicism comes in. It gives us a method to situate people and events within their specific historical context and separates what's considered real history from things like myth. And so through this lens, modern historians might feel confident about making judgments regarding contested sites like the Babri Masjid. But there's this catch. Post-colonial scholars like Dipesh Chakrabarty have shown us that these methods are limited, especially when they're applied to societies where myth and history are deeply intertwined. This is where new historicism tries to offer a solution. It recognizes that culture is messy and interconnected, that no single method can capture everything. Instead of dismissing myth outright, it looks at how beliefs, practices, and stories circulate within a culture. So even so, there's still a problem. For many communities, especially in South Asia, myth and history are not neatly separated. Take the figure of Rama. He's both a mythic and a historical presence for many. In this worldview, myth is not just a story. It's a form of sacred history where figures exist both in and beyond time. And for secular historians who were shaped by the Enlightenment, that's a tough pill to swallow. But acknowledging this complexity helps us better understand why so many people feel passionate about places like the Babri Masjid. It doesn't excuse the destruction of the monument, but it does show us that resolving these kinds of disputes is not just about stating facts. It's also about deeply held beliefs and emotional histories that live alongside the official records. Thank you so much for listening.
Had to relocate from viewing slides, thank you very much, Farhat, to the mic to introduce our next and final speaker on this panel, whose name, unfortunately, I will probably butcher. Forgive me in advance. Dr. Panggah Ardiyansyah? Wow, okay. Dr. Ardiyansyah is a research associate in digital humanities at the University of Sheffield in the UK, focusing on the intersections of colonial and imperial history, digital collections and archives, and digital mediation of history and culture. Trained as an art historian, his interest lies broadly in the production of knowledge related to historical and/or religious materials, both on-site and in museums. His interest in knowledge production has been directed toward probing new methodologies to decolonizing the field of art history and archaeology, in particular for Southeast Asian art. He is currently an academic member for the Getty-funded research project Circumambulating Objects on Paradigms of Restitutions of Southeast Asian Art. So bringing together the discussions of both archives and texts as well as physical monuments, Dr. Ardiyansyah will walk us through the colonial looting of archives manuscripts from the Yogyakarta Kraton Library. Dr. Ardiyansyah, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you also for having me in the panel as well. Good evening to you all from across the pond here in the UK. Let me start by trying to share my screen. Hopefully it's visible. Please tell me if I'm not. Forgive me about the long title. But anyway, I should first start by saying that this paper that I'm going to present is based on an article that I have just co-authored with Dr. Verena Meyer, Assistant Professor of Islam in Southeast Asia at Leiden University, the Netherlands. And this paper will be part of a special issue convened by the Mapping Sumatra's Manuscript Cultural Projects based at SOAS London. For me personally, I came into this to be interested into these topics from two convergent points. First is from my own doctoral projects on the art history of Southeast Asia, in which I was actively leveraging access to manuscripts mediated by digital repositories. And the second point is my sustained interest in issues related to restitutions, particularly on the role of the digital in mediating returns of objects. So to begin with, our departure point is actually this photo, which I screenshotted from a video live stream a few years ago in March 2019, which is the handover of hard disks on the box. If you see the box, you don't really see the hard disk, but it's inside the box. Then the hard disk is containing digital copies of Yogyakarta manuscripts that is now currently in the in the British Library. And this was handed over by then the British ambassador to Indonesia, Mr. Muazzam Malik, and was received by, on the right side is the Sultan, the current Sultan of Yogyakarta, the 10 sultans that is currently residing on the throne. So from this event, what we like to do is to reflect on the narrative built around this handover ceremony and how this handover ceremony has been seen as the return of the manuscripts, has been narrated as such, albeit the return will happen in digital forms. And we would like to put that in the context of global heritage turn and the decolonizing perspective. But first, let's try to contextualize this event both in contemporary and historical terms. So just to note that this digitization of Yogyakarta manuscripts is not really a rarity in the institutional context of the British Library. They have doing this kind of digitization for most of the collection that they have in the British Library. They then for this project digitized 75 manuscripts that they already identified coming from the library of Yogyakarta Kraton. And now these digital copies are available freely and in public domain. And you can search it through the British Library website. I was a bit hesitating there because the access to this digital repository is unfortunately is currently limited due to the ransomware attack to the British Library website in late 2023. Anyway, in the light of this context, I would say that we should note that the argument saying that digitization is often praised for its potential to make knowledge more accessible for a broader public. And I should say that it remains true for the manuscripts, for this manuscript from Yogyakarta, as it's opened up resources of knowledge productions. Since scholars and practitioners based in Yogyakarta are now supposedly able to read and utilize these royal manuscripts at little or no cost because they don't need to travel to London anymore, and then they can do it on their home using computer screen and the likes. But what is actually complicates the state of the collection is how this collection was historically built on colonial violence that happens in the early 19th century, or in June 1812 to be exact, following the taking of Java Island from the Dutch hands to the British. And this sacking of Yogyakarta Kratons was followed by looting of valuable objects, obviously, as usual in this kind of context, historical context, including the Pusaka. And when I said Pusaka, I mean sacred heirlooms or regalia, the embodiment of powers of this palace that give legitimacy to the holder of Pusaka as rulers. So usually the looting of royal Pusaka represents the sacking of the power of the Kratons. And it's also being understood by the colonial power at the time as well, not only British, but also by the Dutch that have their colonial presence in Indonesia. They have a big understanding of this local metric of power through the use of Pusaka in local courts. These events is still known locally as Gegerspehi, which is referring to the army of spoils or Spehi, and still pretty much a local colloquial names for this event in Yogyakarta. And the impacts of these lootings, including the manuscript, is still we can still feel it today, with the Yogyakarta Kraton stating that some links in the chain of transmission have been broken, and that knowledge on certain topics has been lost for a subsequent generation of scholars. And this was something that they also highlighted during the handover ceremony in 2019. But the question is, what actually made the handover of digital copies in March 2019 was so celebrated? Used mostly locally in Yogyakarta Kratons. And we would like to argue that is in part because the memory of the violence is still pretty much present in Yogyakarta today. There are few things that hold these memories. First is there are two manuscripts written by the survivor of the raid, the attacks in 1812. First is by the younger brother of the dethroned Sultan. The other is by the dethroned crown prince of Sultan. And in these manuscripts, they are very much attesting their antipathy toward the British powers, especially the leader at the time, Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles. And this is pretty much still being reproduced today in Yogyakarta. For example, in this diorama of Jogja Archives that was built in November 2022, the name of Raffles is still come up as the leader for raiding and looting of the manuscript from the Yogyakarta Kraton. So the word, I'm sorry, the label is too small to read, but actually the word looted is present on the gallery labels, which is basically in contrast with the one that was made for an exhibition also in the British Library permanent gallery in London, that only stating that the manuscript were acquired after the attack of British forces. So using the word looting is also, or in Indonesian word is menjarah. Jarahan is trying to memorize the violence and the taking of precious pusaka objects from Yogyakarta, even though it's already happened a long time ago in the early 19th century. This is the narrative of the chronology of the returns, quote unquote, from the Yogyakarta sites. The longing for the lost manuscripts, attesting to the political nature of the digitization and the handover ceremony. For those who are not familiar with the history of Indonesia, the current Sultan have dual status as a Sultan, but also as a governor, provincial governor, because of the role of Yogyakarta Kraton during the revolution of Indonesia in the 1950s. Because of the role of the Kraton, now the governor of Yogyakarta as a political role was handed down to the lineage of Sultan, sitting Sultan. And there is also the longing for the lost manuscripts, because there is still oral histories that is still widespread today of this actually about the believing that there were thousands of manuscripts that were taken by the British Army and that now ended up at the British authority, even though the British Library itself only managed to identify only 75 manuscripts in their collection now that coming from the library. So they tried to reach out to the British Library, and was given a stern answer that the transferring or giving back the physical book is not possible because of the regulation in the UK, but they were offered the possibility of digitizing these manuscripts, and they accept that kind of compromise from the Yogyakarta sides. From the British sides, there is also coincide with political will from the curator or the lead curator of the British Library for Southeast Asian collections, Annabel Gallop, and also the ambassadors, the then ambassador, Mr. Muazzam Malik, that you saw in the picture earlier. They have played crucial roles in securing donations to support the funding for these digitizations and making it a priority within the British Library as this institution. So after the digitization, as you saw, there is a presentation happen with the handover ceremony that is organized to coincide with the 30th anniversary of the accession of the current sultans to the throne in March 2019. And during that anniversary, they also organized an international symposium on Japanese studies manuscript of Kraton, Yogyakarta. And it was actually the Sultan himself who officially termed this process as kembali in Indonesian or return in Indonesian, implying a claim of success in preserving and advancing the royal cultures or the palace cultures as the backbone of national identity in Indonesia, of which the royal manuscript are a significant part. Is also trying He is also trying to show Yogyakarta Kraton as an able custodian of Indonesian culture by enacting this return and terming this handover as return or coming home. And it's also in part the repeated use of the word return, coming home, is effectively trying to remind everyone that the Kraton or the palace was and continues to be the origin of those digitized manuscripts that are now currently reside in the British Library, and obliquely bring up question of the authority of the British Library to retain ownership. So it's a bit of strategic. I believe there is a bit of strategic maneuver by the Sultan on terming that handover as a return or as a coming home. Obviously, this is not only part of Yogyakarta Kraton that use or misuse the optics of the ceremony, but also the British Library as well. There is celebrating the success of the digitization and democratization of access to these digitized manuscripts, and the digitization is sometimes you can read along the line is being presented as a pathway to dealing not only with the historical injustice that happened 2 centuries ago in Java, but also helping reconstruct aspects of Japanese heritage that were considered lost after the raid. So this aesthetics, these photo shoots, if you may say so, is not only showing the democratization of knowledge, celebration of digitization, but also somehow represents institution of knowledge as well, with new knowledge being produced to paper presented at the aforementioned symposiums, like in the photo on the right. But there's also restitution of old knowledge as well. That is being the sacred dance that was created by the first Sultan of Yogyakarta in the early 19th century, was able to be reconstructed and performed again based on reading on the Gita's manuscripts, and that was performed before the handover ceremony. So it's sort of giving the appearance that through this digitization, everything is being all good and well with the history in terms of historical reparations. But the question then would be, is digitization really the answer to the epistemic violence instigated by the military raid in 1812 and the manuscript theft that has happened in the past? I'm referring to sort of the quote-unquote original sin of original philology that quote-unquote is arguing to rescue this manuscript from decay by having them transferred to the collection of colonial authorities, and then being investigated through alien methodologies, quote-unquote Western methodologies that is alien to local context of local culture of these manuscript productions, and sometimes or most of the time actually negative reception of this orphan manuscript, saying that they are not conforming the historical characteristic of manuscript to be used as historical sources. And yes, the I would say that digitization can be a possible pathway toward restoring this past injustice by providing further access to this local manuscripts. But it's also in a way complicated by a traditional conception of manuscript as pusaka as well, or sacred heirloom, where the materiality is more pronounced than text itself. And as a pusaka, they can only be accessed by limited people. So it's very much against the nature of democratization of knowledge through digitizations. Because with pusaka, it can only be accessed by quote-unquote right people who have the power to do so, not only in literal but also in figurative sense. Obviously, not all manuscripts are pusaka, but along with this designation, this pusaka designation, there is a restriction on access. There is, like I said, it's in contrast with the inherent quality of digitization, which is to widen up the access for the textual knowledge. But that's for also, but I was talking about the traditional concept of pusaka. What is happening now is actually ambivalent at best, because perspective and understanding are shifting with the introduction and development of local library from the early 20th century in Java and Indonesia in general, or even in Southeast Asia. And texts becoming the essential purpose of books under the hegemony of colonial and local knowledge production. So that traditional understanding of the potential of the manuscript and letters as pusaka came to coexist uneasily with modern notion of letter as mirror of the textual heritage knowledge. And we should also know that there is no protest on the digitization of Yogyakarta manuscripts, and the fact that those digital copies are available publicly through the British Library websites. And most Japanese scholars that we talk to are almost unequivocally supportive of this digitization initiative. So on that note, we are not actually offering any conclusions at this point, because more empirical research, of course, should be carried to answer the question that we try to raise in this paper. But I would like to...
Doctor, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we'd love for you to take a minute more just to wrap up the presentation. 1 more minute, if you don't mind. Okay?
Perfect. I just want to point out this podcast that we that was produced and hosted by our excellent project intern, Sumaiya Hamdani, on this matter. If you're still interested with the story of the digitization of Yogyakarta manuscript and the idea of digital return and repatriation. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.